The wind was a blade against Alara's skin, honed sharp on the endless, frozen expanse of the plains. It found every tear in her worn wool coat, every gap in the thin fabric of her dress, and stole what little warmth she had left. Snow, fine and dry as sand, swirled in blinding sheets, erasing the world behind her and offering nothing but a void ahead. Hunger was a hollow ache in her belly, a constant, dull throb that had long ago silenced the frantic panic of starvation and left only a profound, weary emptiness. She had been running for 6 days. Or was it 7? The sun was a pale, indifferent smear in the gray sky, marking time with no more meaning than the rhythm of her own faltering heartbeat. This was a land that did not forgive. It stripped you down to bone and will, and she felt both turning brittle. Her flight from the cruelties of Mr. Croft's indenture had led her here, into a wilderness far more honest in its brutality. He would see her hang for breaking her contract, for the theft of the half-loaf of bread she'd taken for the journey. But hanging felt like a distant, almost gentle fate compared to this slow, freezing dissolution. Despair was a cold, heavy stone inside her. She leaned against the rough bark of a pine, the only landmark in a sea of white, and allowed her eyes to close. Just for a moment, the thought of sinking into the snow, of letting the cold take her into its final, quiet embrace, was a siren's song. It was a flicker of unnatural darkness against the snow that pulled her back. A shape, half buried in a drift near a fallen horse. Her first thought was of a wolf or a bear, and a primal fear shot through her, momentarily overriding the exhaustion. But the shape was wrong. It was too still. Cautiously, her body screaming in protest, she pushed away from the tree and shuffled forward. The wind tore at her, trying to push her back, to keep her from the discovery. It was a man. He lay face down, one arm flung out as if reaching for something, his dark coat dusted with a thick layer of snow that was quickly becoming a shroud. Beside him lay a horse, its great body contorted in the stillness of death, a dark stain of frozen blood matting the hide on its flank. A sign of wolves or a bad fall. She saw the man's boot, the worn leather and the glint of a spur. A rancher or a traveler. A dead man. A part of her, the scavenger that survival had made of her, noted the quality of his coat, the rifle still scabbarded on the dead horse's saddle. She knelt, her knees sinking into the biting cold of the snow. Her fingers, numb and clumsy, brushed the snow from his neck, seeking the last confirmation of his fate. And then she felt it. A pulse. Faint, thready, but undeniably there. A life, guttering like a candle flame in the gale. He was alive. For a long moment, she simply stared. Logic told her to walk away. He was a large man, a dead weight. Saving him was an impossibility, an act of foolishness that would only hasten her own end. She had nothing to offer him but her own dwindling store of vitality. But as she looked at his still form, at the mercy of the same unforgiving elements that were consuming her, she saw not a stranger, but a reflection. To leave him here was to accept that this was all the world was. A cold, lonely place where the fallen were left to be buried by the snow. She had been left. She had been abandoned. The thought solidified into a resolve so fierce it was almost warm. She would not do the same. She would not let the wilderness have him. The struggle to move him was a nightmare of burning muscles and sobbing breaths. She found his cabin less than a quarter-mile away, a low-slung shape of dark timber almost camouflaged against a stand of pines, a curl of long-dead smoke whispering from its stone chimney. It was a miracle. Using the dead horse's saddle blanket as a makeshift travois, she dragged him, inch by painstaking inch, across the frozen ground. The cabin door was unlocked. Inside, the air was frigid, but it was still. It was shelter. With the last of her strength, she hauled him over the threshold and collapsed beside him on the rough-hewn floorboards, the world dissolving into a black, roaring tide of exhaustion. The first days were a fugue state, a cycle of tasks performed by a body that felt disconnected from her mind. Her first priority was fire. She found matches in a tin on the mantel and with trembling hands, brought a flame to the kindling laid in the hearth. The first hesitant flicker, The first crackle of burning wood felt like a resurrection. The fire became the center of their small universe, a fragile bastion against the howling storm outside. She melted snow for water, boiling it in a soot-blackened pot she found hanging by the hearth. There was a small store of provisions, a sack of flour, dried beans, salted meat. Not much, but enough. She tended to the man with a focused, desperate sort of care. He had a nasty gash on his temple and his left leg was broken, the bone jutting at an unnatural angle beneath his trousers. She cleaned the head wound with boiled water and a strip of cloth torn from her own petticoat. The leg was beyond her skill, so she could do little more than pack it with snow to keep the swelling down. An old folk remedy she wasn't even sure she believed. He burned with fever, his unconsciousness punctuated by low groans and half-formed words that meant nothing to her. She spooned broth made from the salted meat and snowmelt between his cracked lips, bathed his face, and kept the fire fed. In those long, quiet hours, with only the crackle of the flames and the moan of the wind for company, she began to see the man not as a burden, but as a purpose. His life depended on her, and that responsibility anchored her. It pushed back the despair that had gnawed at her for so long. She studied his face in the flickering firelight. A strong jawline shadowed with stubble, lines of hardship etched around his eyes and mouth. He was not a soft man. This cabin, stark and utilitarian, spoke of a life of solitude and work. There was a single bunk, a table with 2 chairs, and a shelf of worn books. Everything had its place. Everything was for function, not comfort. She felt like an intruder, a ghost haunting his austere life. Yet she was also his only keeper. She noticed the way his hand, even in unconsciousness, would sometimes clench, as if holding on to something. She wondered what ghosts haunted him. On the 3rd day he woke. His eyes, a startlingly clear gray, fixed on her. There was no softness in them, only a sharp, assessing confusion that quickly hardened into suspicion. "Who are you?" His voice was a dry rasp, rough with disuse. Alara froze, the wet cloth in her hand dripping onto the floor. Fear, cold and familiar, coiled in her stomach. He was awake. He was a man. And she was a woman alone and in his debt. "Alara," she whispered, her own voice sounding foreign. "What are you doing here?" "I found you," she said, her gaze dropping to the floor. "In the snow. Your horse." She didn't need to finish. He tried to push himself up, a sharp gasp of pain cutting him short as his body reminded him of its betrayal. He fell back against the pillows she had fashioned from sacks, his face pale. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the small fire, the pot of broth, her torn petticoat used as a bandage. His gaze returned to her, the suspicion warring with a dawning comprehension. He saw her thinness, the dark circles under her eyes, the raw, chapped skin of her hands. He said nothing more, but the silence was heavy with unspoken questions. Trust was not given. It was earned in the silence between them. He remained wary, his stoicism a wall she could not penetrate. And she remained timid, conditioned by a life where a man's attention was always a prelude to a command or a threat. Their communication was sparse, pared down to necessities. "More water, the fire is low, thank you," that last one, uttered by him on the 4th day after she'd helped him reset the crude splint on his leg, landed with the weight of a tome. It was an acknowledgement, a concession. It made her feel a warmth the fire couldn't provide. She learned his routines without being told, saw the quiet rhythm of his solitary life. He showed her, with gestures and clipped phrases, how to properly clean his rifle to protect it from the damp. She, in turn, learned to make a passable bread from the flour and water, baking it in the embers. They were 2 solitary creatures, trapped in a bubble of warmth while the world raged outside. The storm that had nearly killed them both now became their sanctuary, insulating them from the world beyond the cabin walls. In the quiet moments, he would watch her. She could feel his gaze as she stirred the bean pot or stared into the flames. He saw more than she knew. He saw the way she flinched if he moved too suddenly. He saw the faint, faded scar that curled around her wrist, a pale bracelet of old pain. He never asked. The questions he did ask were practical. "Do you know how to shoot?" She shook her head. "You should learn," was all he said. His name was Silas. He offered it one evening as she handed him a cup of broth. He said it as if it were a tool, an object he was entrusting to her care. "Ilara?" She repeated her own name, a quiet confirmation of the strange, unspoken pact that was forming between them. On the 5th day, the storm broke. Sunlight, thin but brilliant, pierced through the cabin's single window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The world outside was pristine, silent, and blindingly white. The sanctuary was broken. The world had returned. Silas struggled to sit up, his face set with grim determination. "I need to get to town. For supplies. A proper doctor for this leg." Fear, sharp and immediate, gripped Ilara. "Town. People. The law. Mr. Croft. I can't," she stammered, backing away. "You're not going," Silas said, his voice firm but not unkind. He looked at her, his gray eyes holding a flicker of something she couldn't name. "Understanding, perhaps. You'll be safe here. No one comes up this trail. No one even knows it exists. You stay. Keep the fire lit." He trusted her to keep his home. The thought was staggering. He was entrusting her with everything he had. But leaving her alone felt almost as dangerous as going with him. What if he didn't come back? What if he sent the sheriff instead? Her past had taught her that trust was a currency for fools. Yet, looking at his steady gaze, she found a sliver of it inside her. She gave a small, jerky nod. He was her rescuer now, as much as she had been his. The journey to the town of redemption was an agony for Silas, each jolt of the mule sending a fresh wave of fire up his splinted leg. The pristine snow could not mask the ugliness of the settlement. A muddy main street gouged by wagon wheels and flanked by grim-faced wooden storefronts. It was a place he avoided, a place of noise and judgment, so different from the profound silence of his mountain. He conducted his business with his usual curt efficiency, his mind already on the return journey, on the quiet woman with the haunted eyes he had left to guard his home. As he was loading sacks of flour and oats onto his mule, a commotion from the center of the street drew his attention. A large, ornate carriage, ostentatious and out of place, was stopped before the saloon. A portly man in a fine wool coat and bowler hat stood beside it, his face florid with anger. His name was Croft, a freight owner known for his wealth and his ruthlessness. "A lesson in gratitude," Croft bellowed to the small crowd of onlookers. "This is what becomes of thieves and runaways who break a sacred contract." Silas's blood ran cold. He followed the direction of Croft's pointing finger, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. There, tethered to the iron-rimmed wheel of the carriage by a short, heavy chain locked around her ankle, was Ilara. She was a different person from the woman he'd left that morning. The quiet competence, the flicker of strength she had found by his hearth, was extinguished. She stood hunched against the cold, her face a blank mask of resignation. Her gaze was fixed on the muddy ground, her body utterly still, as if she had retreated to a place deep inside herself where the humiliation could not reach her. The townsfolk stared, a mixture of mild pity and detached curiosity on their faces. They saw property. They saw a cautionary tale. Silas saw the woman who had dragged him from the snow. He saw the person who had bathed his head, fed him broth from her own meager portion, and sat vigil through his fever. He saw the faint scar on her wrist and suddenly understood its origin with a sickening clarity. A rage, cold and pure, settled over him. It was an unfamiliar feeling for a man who lived his life by the creed of minding his own business. But this, he realized with absolute certainty, was his business. He tethered his mule and walked toward the carriage. His limp was pronounced, his progress slow, but every step was deliberate. The small crowd parted for him, sensing the dangerous stillness that surrounded him. Croft, momentarily distracted from his tirade, turned to face this new interruption. "What do you want, mountain man?" Croft sneered, looking Silas up and down with disdain. Silas didn't look at him. His eyes were fixed on Alara. He saw a slight tremor in her hands, the only sign of the terror she must be feeling. "Let her go," he said. The words were quiet, but they cut through the air with the authority of a judge's gavel. Croft let out a bark of laughter. "Let her go? This is my property, bought and paid for. An indentured servant, bound by law for another 3 years. She's a thief, and she's going back with me to face justice." Silas slowly raised his gaze from Alara to Croft. There was no heat in his eyes, only a flat, chilling emptiness. He reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy leather pouch. Without a word, he tossed it onto a nearby rain barrel. It landed with a solid, definitive clink of coin. "I'm buying her contract," Silas stated. It was not a negotiation. Croft's eyes widened, his greed momentarily overriding his arrogance. He snatched the pouch and loosened the drawstring, his practiced fingers sifting through the gold and silver coins. It was a substantial sum, likely more than the woman was worth for 10 years of service, let alone 3. He looked from the money to Silas's unyielding face, then to the woman chained to his wheel. "She's more trouble than she's worth," Croft grumbled, attempting to save face. He pulled a key from his waistcoat pocket. "Fine. She's your problem now." He bent down and unlocked the iron clasp around Alara's ankle. The chain fell away, landing in the mud with a dull clatter. The sound was deafening in the sudden silence. Alara didn't move. She seemed unable to process what had just happened, her body still locked in its posture of surrender. Silas stepped forward, ignoring Croft and the watching town. He gently took her arm. Her muscles were rigid beneath the thin fabric of her sleeve. He said nothing, simply turned and began to lead her away. His touch was firm, protective, a silent anchor in the maelstrom of her shock. He led her to his mule, helped her mount it with a care that was starkly at odds with his rugged appearance. And then, with the supplies loaded, he began the slow walk back up the trail, leading the animal away from the town of redemption and toward the mountain that promised true sanctuary. The journey back was silent, the only sounds the crunch of their feet on the snow and the soft snort of the mule. Alara sat numbly, the rhythmic sway of the animal a lulling motion that slowly thawed the ice in her veins. The cold mountain air felt clean, washing away the stench of the town's cruelty and her own fear. When they finally reached the cabin, the sun was setting, painting the snow-covered peaks in hues of soft pink and deep violet. The wisp of smoke from the chimney was a welcome beacon. Her fire was still going. She had kept it lit. Silas helped her down, his hands steady on her waist. Inside, the warmth of the cabin enveloped them. He added a log to the fire, and the flames leaped up, casting dancing shadows on the walls. He turned to face her. Her ordeal in town hung in the air between them, a heavy, unspoken thing. He had to give it a name to banish it. "That man," Silas began, his voice rough with an emotion he could not hide. "He will not trouble you again." He reached into his pocket and pulled out not a key for a chain, but a simple iron key, the key to the cabin door. He held it out to her, his calloused palm open. "This is your home now," he said, his gaze direct and unwavering. "If you want it, you are not bound. You are free to go or you are free to stay. The choice is yours." Alara looked from his earnest face to the key resting in his hand. It was more than a piece of metal. It was a promise. It was respect. It was the one thing she had never been given in her entire life. A choice. The strength she had feared was lost forever began to unspool inside her. A warm, steady thread. She was not the same girl who had run into the wilderness. She had survived the storm. She had saved a life. She had been bought, but for the first time it was an act not of ownership but of liberation. Her hand, steady and sure, reached out and took the key from his palm. Her fingers closed around it, felt solid, felt real. She met his gaze, and for the first time, there was no fear in her eyes, only a profound, quiet gratitude and a resilient light that the fire's glow could not match. Here, in this small cabin on the edge of the world, She was no longer running. She was home,